Hello everyone, this is Micah History, and welcome to the Canada Day special, where I will be covering the history of Canada. Now, for some of the oldest viewers, or in other words, the viewers who have been here the longest, you might ask yourself, hey, didn't you already make a video, or actually two videos about the history of Canada? I did. I made those about 5 years ago, just a little over 5 years ago. But I have rewatched them and I realized they're pretty bad. My voice sort of sounded weird, and also more importantly, the editing was pretty bad. And so I decided that now would be as good of a time as ever to make this video once again. The original video is unlisted, so I guess if you have the link somehow you can still find it. But this video is going to be much more in detail, and this one's also going to be better than the last one. So without further ado, let's get started. In 985, when an Icelandic merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland, he was blown off course and he sighted land west of the fleet. This was the first time a European ever saw Canada. He described his discovery to Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, who had been the first ever person to settle in Greenland. And Leif then decided to explore the area in more detail. This was the beginning of the period of early colonization. Leif sailed west in 1000 with a crew of 35 people. The Norwegians explored three different areas: Helluland or Baffin Island, Markland or Labrador, and Vinland in northern Newfoundland. This made him the first European to explore Nunavut and Newfoundland and Labrador. It was Vinland where Leif became the first European to land in Canada, and he founded a city called Leifbudir. The first European colony in Canada was Vinland, which covered northern Newfoundland. In 1004, Leif's brother Thorvald Eriksson sailed to Vinland with 30 men, and the following year he attacked 9 native people. The 9th one was able to escape and soon came back to the Norwegian camp with a force. Thorvald was killed by an arrow, the first ever known battle in Canadian history, and this would make Thorvald, unfortunately, the first ever European to die in Canada. In 1009, Thorfinn Karlsefni, another European explorer, left to go to Vinland. However, fighting soon broke out, and in 1010 the Norwegians retreated and abandoned Vinland, ending the Norwegian colonization of Canada after just 10 years. But then, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, who, by the way, I've made a video about him, so check that out, a Genoese explorer, sailed west to find South and Southeast Asia, which restarted the European colonization of the Americas. Soon, most European countries, including England, were interested in the route crossing the Atlantic that would get them to South and Southeast Asia. In 1497, Henry VII, King of England and Lord of Ireland, hired a Venetian explorer called John Cabot to find a route to cross the Atlantic to get to the Maluku Islands. However, on the 24th of June, he ended up in Newfoundland, becoming the first European to go to Canada since the Norwegians. But since he thought that he had arrived in the Maluku Islands, he didn't bother colonizing it. He did end up returning the following year, though, in search of the Northwest Passage, which was a passage that the Europeans believed could bring them from the Atlantic to the Pacific without going down all the way past South America. And he became the first European to explore New Brunswick and Nova Scotia before disappearing. Now, he wasn't the only explorer in the area, with Portuguese explorer João Fernandes Lavrador becoming the first to explore the mainland north of Newfoundland in 1498, which would be named Labrador in his honor. Now, he wasn't the only Portuguese explorer in the area, since in 1501 and 1502, Gaspar and Miguel Corte Real explored Labrador and the newly named island of Newfoundland, which they claimed for Portugal. In 1534, Francis I, King of France, sent Jacques Cartier, a French explorer, to explore Canada. He became the first European to explore Quebec and Prince Edward Island, as well as the first to land in Quebec. He then named the land Canada the following year, following a mistranslation of the local word for village. He then sailed down the St. Lawrence River to modern-day Montreal. Cartier found a fort at Charlesbourg Royal in Cap Rouge, now in Quebec City, in 1541, and this was the first colony in Canada since the time of the Norwegians, but it was abandoned the next year. Finally, in 1576, Martin Frobisher, an English explorer, became the first European to land in Nunavut and the first European to also explore the Northwest Territories. However, European colonization of Canada really began in 1605. After several unsuccessful French colonies were founded, in 1604 France colonized Nova Scotia, making it the first permanent colony in Canada and founding Acadia, the first permanent colony in New France. It was also the first time that Europeans landed in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. This ended the early colonial period and started the period of French domination of Canada. The settlement was known as Port Royal and was founded by Samuel de Champlain. Though only 80 people survived the first winter, with only 11 of them being healthy, it was the first time this colony had worked out for France. In 1608, France colonized the northeastern St. Lawrence River when Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City with 28 men, of which 20 died, meaning only 8 survived. However, the settlement survived, and it would become the capital of New France. In 1609, France colonized Prince Edward Island and Anticosti. However, despite these successes, in order for his colonies to survive, Champlain decided to send out young French men to live with the natives so that they could learn how to adapt to living in this land. In 1610, one of these coureurs du bois, as they came to be known, or runners of the woods, Etienne Brulé, became the first European to explore Ontario, as well as the first to see Lakes Ontario, Huron, and Superior. In 1610, the colonies of Canada and Acadia were connected with the colonization of northern New Brunswick. The English didn't take long to notice what their chief rivals were up to, though, and in 1610 they decided to colonize eastern Newfoundland, establishing the Newfoundland Colony, which was the first permanent colony in Newfoundland and Labrador. The following year, in 1611, English explorer Henry Hudson became the first European to explore Manitoba, while the next year, in 1612, another English explorer, Thomas Budden, became the first European to land there. Then, in 1615, the French and English got into more conflict as the French colonized western Newfoundland, and they brought their first Catholic missionaries to Canada. Now, in 1627, another Anglo-French war broke out, and in an attempt to consolidate control, Cardinal Richelieu, who was basically running the French government, made Samuel de Champlain the governor of New France and banned non-Catholics from staying there, causing its Protestant population to move to the English colonies. This reduced the population of all of New France to a whopping 85 people. He also established the seigneurial system, which established a feudal system of farming that would continue for centuries. Even worse, in 1628, the first African slave in Canada, an 8-year-old boy from Madagascar, arrived. The next year, the English captured Quebec City as well as Nova Scotia, which was given that name by William Alexander, the first Earl of Stirling, who tried to establish a Scottish colony. This failed, though, when the war ended in 1631 and it was returned to France. Although New France continued as a colony, it had barely survived, and the French recognized the need to create more colonies, leading to the founding of Trois-Rivières in 1634. The following year, Samuel de Champlain died, having successfully established New France as an extension of France and Canada. But with his death, it came under the control of the Catholic Church, who tried to establish a French and native Catholic utopia. To this end, Sainte Marie of the Incarnation founded a school and convent for French and native girls in 1638. In the following year, the Jesuits established the mission of Sainte Marie among the Hurons in Ontario. The first French colony in Ontario was established in 1642 when the French completed their colonization of the St. Lawrence River by reaching Lake Ontario. That year also saw the founding of Montreal by Paul de Chomedy, Sieur de Maisonneuve, and Jeanne Mance, who named it Ville-Marie. In 1644, Jeanne Mance opened the first hospital in North America. However, New France would soon find itself at threat once again with the outbreak of the Beaver Wars in 1649, when the English allied Iroquois conquered land in southern Ontario from the French, who were allied with their rivals, the Huron. Now, by 1650, New France controlled Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, the St. Lawrence region, and parts of southern Ontario. But in this entire area, they only had 700 colonists. To grow New France, it needed more people, and as such, more people were brought in, such as Louis Chartier, the first surgeon in Ville-Marie. Sainte Marguerite Bourgeois became the first teacher in Ville-Marie in 1653 and established the first order of nuns in North America 5 years later. In 1663, the French crown under newly in charge King Louis XIV took direct control over New France, which became a royal province. By this time, the province had 3,000 people and would now be under the control of an intendant, Jean Talon, who arrived in 1665 with 1,100 soldiers, the first large European army in Canada, which was sent to deal with the Iroquois. Talon replaced the Bishop of Quebec as the most powerful man in New France, and he decided to reorganize it, creating the first census in Canadian history in 1666, which revealed 3,215 settlers, of which 2,034 were men and 1,181 were women. Now, as you can see, there were way less women than men, and so Louis XIV organized a program to send single, virtuous, and fit women between the ages of 15 and 30 to New France, and these women would become known as the King's Daughters. 800 women, mostly from northwestern France, would immigrate between 1663 and 1673, and this increased the population from 3,200 to 6,700 people. In 1669, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers explored Lake Superior and Lake Erie for the English, leading to the creation of the Hudson's Bay Company the following year to trade fur. They established Fort Rupert in the Hudson Bay, leading to the creation of the colony of Rupert's Land on the 2nd of May, the first ever English colony in Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba, and they soon established several trading posts. In 1673, France colonized the area around Lake Superior, and by 1675, New France had 8,000 people. In 1688, the 9 Years' War broke out between France and England, and this time fighting actually happened in Canada. In October 1690, the Battle of Quebec took place between the colonies of New France and Massachusetts Bay, with the English trying to take Quebec but failing. The war ended in 1697 with France conquering all of Newfoundland after nearly obliterating the English population on the island. However, peace won't last long, and in 1701 the War of the Spanish Succession broke out between, once again, France and England, and France used that as an opportunity to finally conquer southern Ontario from the Iroquois. With that accomplished, the Great Peace of Montreal was signed between New France and 39 native nations, ending the Beaver Wars. But war was still raging with England, which reconquered most of Newfoundland in 1706. In 1710, England, now known as Great Britain, conquered Acadia, and the next year conquered the area around the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. In 1713, the war ended, and Great Britain conquered mainland Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. In Nova Scotia, France was only left with Cape Breton Island and Prince Edward Island, which became the colonies of Ile Royale and Ile Saint-Jean, respectively. Meanwhile, the 2,500 Acadians now found themselves under British rule, though there were about 16,000 French Canadians in total. By 1720, the colony of Canada had a population of 24,954, and by 1730, it was 42,701. In 1726, Rupert's Land greatly expanded so that it now bordered French territory, which now extended to Manitoba after 1734. Between 1731 and 1737, the King's Highway was built between Montreal and Quebec City, which was the longest road north of Mexico in the Americas. In 1740, another war broke out between Great Britain and France, this time again over succession, but the Austrian succession. Now, the War of Austrian Succession ended in 1748, but it prompted the British to found Halifax in Nova Scotia, the first time a British colony had been created using public instead of private capital. This led to the native Mi'kmaq people considering it a violation of the treaties that they had signed in 1726, and so Father Le Loutre's War broke out between them and the British. Now, of course, the French were not going to miss an opportunity to go to war with the British again, but this was a mistake as they and the Mi'kmaq would be completely driven out of Nova Scotia, although they managed to retain control of New Brunswick. Once the war ended in 1755, there were 55,000 French people in Canada, and the British decided that they had had enough of the Acadians. So Nova Scotia's governor, Charles Lawrence, ordered for their expulsion, resulting in 11,400 being deported to British and French North America over the next decade. Most of them would end up settling in Louisiana, where they would create the Cajun culture, which is a short version of Acadian. They would be replaced by the New England planters, who were the first major group of English-speaking settlers in Canada who did not arrive directly from Great Britain, and about 8,000 of these people would migrate throughout the 1760s. Now, in 1756, the 7 Years' War broke out, and can you guess the sides? Yeah, you can. It's France and Great Britain once again who are at war. The British acted decisively, capturing and destroying the major French fortress at Louisbourg in 1758, which gave them control of the region. However, the decisive moment happened at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on the 13th of September 1759, which ended the siege of Quebec and gave the British control over the city. Between July and September 1760, Montreal was captured, resulting in the near total conquest of New France. This was finalized with a British victory in 1763, and at the Treaty of Paris, all of New France was ceded to Great Britain. New France's 70,000 inhabitants were now all subjects of King George III, who quickly issued the Royal Proclamation, which was the first ever document in Canadian history to recognize the Indigenous title to their land. Now under British control, Canada was reorganized, with Acadia becoming New Brunswick and Canada renamed as the province of Quebec, with control of Labrador, southern Quebec, and southern Ontario. Additionally, Rupert's Land was now extended to southern Alberta and Saskatchewan and most of Manitoba. In 1769, the island of St. John was separated from the colony of Nova Scotia and would later be renamed Prince Edward Island. In 1774, meanwhile, Juan José Pérez Hernández, a Spanish explorer, became the first ever European to explore British Columbia. In Quebec, the British initially tried to suppress French culture, but as it became obvious that they would not be assimilated, in 1774 the Quebec Act was passed, which outlined how Quebec would be governed. The British decided to maintain the old system, keeping the seigneurial system, ensuring free practice of Catholicism, and leaving property and civil laws to be decided according to the French legal system. This made people in the British colonies further south angry, and was one of the many reasons they declared war the next year, starting the American Revolutionary War. The new Patriot Army decided to invade Canada, expecting widespread support. Though migrants from the 13 colonies and English merchants generally supported the revolution, the upper class, clergy, and landowners were generally opposed to it. Among French Canadians, there was some sympathy, but it was not the majority of people who supported it, especially because many patriots were fighting specifically as a reaction to the Quebec Act, among other issues. The Patriots captured Montreal, but were beaten back on the final day of the year at the Battle of Quebec, thanks to Guy Carleton. Because of this, the tide turned, and Canada's future as separate from the United States was ensured, especially as the United States declared independence the next year without including Canada. Although Canada was saved from conquest, the United States won the war in 1783 and conquered the southwestern part of the Quebec province, which now became the American Northwest Territory. The Americans who had remained loyal to the British, known as United Empire Loyalists, now found themselves in a country that they did not feel that they belonged to. 15% of them, around 70,000, left the country, of which 50,000 fled to Canada. So many of them settled in western Nova Scotia that in 1784 it was split off and turned into the colony of New Brunswick. They turned these formerly French-speaking areas into English-speaking areas. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, in 1783, Spain colonized British Columbia and southern Yukon as part of the colony of Nootka. This made it the first country to colonize British Columbia and Yukon, but the next year it was shared between Spain and Great Britain, which now controlled land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. With 8,000 Loyalist settlers having settled in the southwest of the province of Quebec, in 1791 it was split into English-speaking Upper Canada and French-speaking Lower Canada under the Constitutional Act of 1791. Back in Nootka, as you could imagine, the Spanish and British weren't exactly cooperating, and this led to the Nootka Crisis in 1789, in which Spain prepared for war with French backing. However, that backing never came, since France was a bit distracted in 1789, if you guys know what I mean. This led to the British sending an expedition under Alexander Mackenzie by land between 1792 and 1793, and under George Vancouver to explore the area by sea between 1791 and 1795. This led the Spanish to abandon Nootka entirely in 1795. The following year, York, now Toronto, was chosen as the capital of Upper Canada, which also became the first British colony to abolish slavery in 1793. Back in the West, more expeditions were organized by the British to explore what is now British Columbia, under people like David Thompson and Simon Fraser. Now, in 1812, the War of 1812 began. Yeah, wow, good job, historians, whoever named that war. And it was a war between the United States and the United Kingdom over maritime disputes and land disputes on the frontier. American frontier states wanted to invade Canada to suppress the natives' raids on their settlements, which had been supported by the British. They mainly focused on invading Upper Canada because many of the settlers there were Americans, and so they assumed that they would be greeted as liberators. However, because the majority of people there were descendants of Loyalists or French Canadians, they opposed the invasion, leading to its defeat at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October. Another invasion was organized the following year, during which York was captured and burned. But once the Americans advanced into Lower Canada, they were defeated at the Battle of Chateauguay and later the Battle of Chrysler's Farm. In 1814, the Americans were driven out of Canada at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. And though the war ended with no changes, it was seen as a victory in Canada, since Canadians had managed to repel the Americans, and some even ended up burning the White House, although don't tell that to Americans. This would be the last time Canada was ever invaded, and it resulted in firm British control of the land, with the border settled at the 49th parallel in 1819 at the London Convention, which also established joint British and American control of Oregon Country, which included most of British Columbia. Nevertheless, the British were now wary of American influence in Canada, and this led to the second main wave of immigration to Canada, known as the Great Migration. The British had been worried about how 300,000 French people in Lower Canada and Rupert's Land and 200,000 American people in Upper Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and southern Lower Canada had made up the majority of the Canadian population, and they feared that these people might be open to invaders in case of another American invasion. Therefore, they encouraged immigration from the British Isles after the War of 1812. Now, in 1820, New Brunswick formally split from Nova Scotia, and 5 years later, the rest of mainland Canada was colonized, founding the colony of the Northwest Territories, which was the first colony in the province of the same name today. Although the British had tried their best to get rid of French and American influence in Canada, American and French Republican ideas had a lot of sway in Canada. As a result, more immigration from the British Isles was encouraged, and in Upper Canada, a conservative oligarchy known as the Family Compact was formed. Its members were opposed to democracy and represented the interests of the Loyalist and Anglican elite. In Lower Canada, these people were known as the Lower Canada Tories, mostly British merchants, along with some French landowners who wanted the French Canadians to assimilate into English culture through the abolition of the seigneurial system, the replacement of French civil law with English common law, and the replacement of the Catholic Church with the Anglican Church. However, there was growing opposition to these elites, and in 1837, two major rebellions broke out, one in Upper Canada and one in Lower Canada. After the arrest of the Speaker of the Lower Canadian Assembly, Louis-Joseph Papineau, his supporters, the Patriotes, broke out in rebellion, but they were soon crushed, and Papineau fled to the United States. Inspired by Papineau's rebellion, the Scottish mayor of Toronto, William Lyon Mackenzie, organized a rebellion to establish a democratic republic free from British rule. After his defeat at the Battle of Montgomery's Tavern on the 7th of December, his disorganized army was scattered, and he fled to the United States. Nevertheless, rebellions continued the following year, and soon Montreal was surrounded. Insurrectionist Robert Nelson read the Declaration of Independence of Lower Canada in Napierville in 1838. Although both rebellions were soon crushed, it was obvious that things needed to change, and to this end, the British sent John Lambton, 1st Earl of Durham, to write a report on how to fix this problem. After 5 months in Canada, the Durham Report was completed in 1839, which advocated for a responsible government, a government that would be responsible to the will of the colonists themselves instead of the British government. He also saw the French Canadians as backwards and saw the only solution to the French problem as assimilation, so he advocated for the union of Upper and Lower Canada so that this would be possible. This led to the Act of Union 1840, which united the two colonies into the province of Canada, with English as the only official language in 1841. The ascension of James Bruce, 8th Earl of Elgin, as Governor-General in 1847 led to the pardon of the rebel leaders and the implementation of responsible government in 1848, after its implementation in Nova Scotia earlier that year. For the first time, most Canadian men now enjoyed democratic rights. In 1846, the modern borders of Canada were finally created, when Oregon Territory was split between the United States and the United Kingdom, with the Oregon Treaty establishing the border at the 49th parallel. In 1849, Vancouver Island was established as a colony, with its capital at Fort Victoria, and in 1853, the colony of Queen Charlotte Islands was established. After gold was found in the Fraser Valley, the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush happened in 1858, leading to a large influx of American gold miners. In order to maintain order and prevent the Hudson Bay Company from taking all the profit, Governor James Douglas created the colony of British Columbia, which then incorporated the colony of the Queen Charlotte Islands in 1863 and Vancouver Island in 1866. Everything north of the 60th parallel remained as part of the Northwest Territories. In 1850, meanwhile, the Great Migration ended, having changed Canada from a majority French Catholic area to a majority English Protestant area. During this period, 480,000 English and Scottish people immigrated to Canada, and especially after the Great Famine from 1845 to 1852, 320,000 Irish people also immigrated. Throughout the 1850s, many politicians in the province of Canada began contemplating Western expansion and launched a series of expeditions into the lands held by the Hudson's Bay Company. Nevertheless, Canada was still deeply divided between French and English Canadians, and few politicians could unite the populations. Entered John A. Macdonald, a conservative politician who, in league with the French conservative Georges-Étienne Cartier and George Brown, decided to create a Canadian federation to resist American expansion. In 1864, this led to the Charlottetown and Quebec conferences, which came up with 72 resolutions that would lay out a framework to unite all 8 British colonies in Canada, which were the Colonies of Canada, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, Rupert's Land, Northwest Territory, New Brunswick, and British Columbia. Now, by this time, Canada had a population of 3 million. Once the government was figured out, the London Conference of 1866 was held, which led to the British North America Act, uniting the colonies of Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia into the Dominion of Canada, with its capital in Ottawa. Now, this didn't make Canada independent, but it became a lot more autonomous and self-governing. This ended the period of British domination and started the period of post-Confederation Canada. However, the new Dominion had a lot of challenges to face, such as the need for railroads in the Maritimes, possible northward American expansion after the end of their Civil War in 1865, and the clash between English-Canadian nationalists who wanted the Dominion to be dominated by English language and culture, and the French-Canadian nationalists who wanted control over French-speaking Quebec. There was also division between Liberals, who wanted a decentralized and more democratic union, and the Conservatives, who wanted a more centralized union. How would Canada navigate these divisions? Let's find out. Canada faced its first major challenge very quickly with the outbreak of the Red River Rebellion in 1869 by the Métis, who are descendants of natives and French people. It was caused by the Canadian government's encouragement of English settlers in their land, which culminated in Métis leader Louis Riel's execution of Thomas Scott, a Protestant. This led to outrage among the English Protestant Canadians, and Prime Minister John A. Macdonald sent militia to the newly acquired Northwest Territories to put down the Métis Rebellion. Nevertheless, the province of Manitoba was created in 1870, which would protect the rights of all, English, French, Métis, Native, Catholic, and Protestant. Although the Métis were half Native, the Canadians were definitely not nicer to the pure Natives, who had to sign a Treaty of Ceres that would relinquish their claim on the land, opening up their land for settlement and leaving them in reservations. This culminated in the Indian Act of 1876, which governed the relations between the government and Native Canadians and established the residential school system to educate them. Meanwhile, to get the other 6 colonies to join it, Canada promised to build a railroad that would stretch all across the country. This caused British Columbia to join in 1871 and Prince Edward Island to join in 1873. That year, Macdonald created the Northwest Mounted Police to police the Northwest Territories and assert Canadian sovereignty against American encroachment. These Mounties, as they would come to be known, were legendary for their ability to keep law and order, as opposed to the Wild West going on in the United States. By this time, the government was spending a quarter of its budget on the Canadian Pacific Railway. In 1876, Keewatin was split from the Northwest Territories, and in 1880, Canada acquired the British Arctic Territories as part of the Northwest Territories. In 1878, John A. Macdonald returned to power as Prime Minister after having lost to Alexander Mackenzie in 1873, and he decided to create the National Policy, which was a series of tariffs aimed to protect Canadian trade against the United States. The disputes with the Métis had never truly ended, especially with the influx of more English settlers, and in 1884 Louis Riel was petitioned to send grievances to the Canadian government. Instead, he decided to organize a new rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion. However, this quickly got crushed by the Canadians, who arrived on the new railway to the rebel capital Batoche. Louis Riel was not able to escape this time, and he was convicted of high treason. Despite widespread opposition among French Canadians, John A. Macdonald decided to hang him. The use of the railway during the rebellion led to its completion in November, making it the longest railway in the world. Nevertheless, the suppression of the rebellion didn't end conflict, but only exacerbated it as more English settlers moved west, especially into Manitoba, which in 1890 stopped funding Catholic schools and removed French as an official language. This became a major crisis in the country, leading to Prime Minister Mackenzie Bowles' replacement by Quebec French Catholic Wilfrid Laurier in 1896. Laurier eventually created a compromise where French would be taught in schools where there were a large number of French students, which didn't satisfy either side but did solve the problem eventually. The following year would be pivotal in Canadian history. It not only saw the first French Prime Minister come to power, but also the discovery of gold in the Yukon Territory and the beginning of the mass settlement of the prairies. Many Eastern Europeans, especially Ukrainians, began migrating to what the government advertised as the last best West, and this wave of immigration and economic growth led to Canada having the fastest growing economy for the following 15 years. The Klondike Gold Rush in 1897 led to 30 to 40,000 people coming to Yukon to find their wealth, and it became its own territory in 1898, separating from the Northwest Territories. Although Canada didn't end up overwhelmed by a wave of American immigrants, it did lose its boundary dispute with Alaska in 1903. Now, in 1902, Otto Sverdrup, a Norwegian explorer, claimed the Sverdrup Islands for Norway. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier hoped to unite English and French Canadians as a common people instead of just looking towards the United Kingdom. However, his assumptions were questioned in 1899 with the outbreak of the Second Boer War, and English Canadians enthusiastically answered the call for troops by the motherland. Laurier eventually organized a volunteer force to fight, which got him major flack from Henri Bourassa, a French-Canadian nationalist who did not want Canadians fighting for British wars. By the beginning of the 20th century, the future for Canada looked bright. In 1905, Alberta and Saskatchewan were separated from the Northwest Territories, which also reincorporated Keewatin. Laurier created the Royal Canadian Navy, but it faced criticism from Bourassa, who thought it would be used by the British in their wars, and also from English Canadian nationalists who did not want to remove Canada from the British fold. This controversy led to Laurier's downfall in 1911, and he was replaced by Robert Borden as Prime Minister. In 1907, Newfoundland became a dominion. Between 1911 and 1913, a third wave of immigration, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, happened, but this was stopped by the outbreak of World War I in 1914, ending the post-Confederation period. Most Canadians supported the war effort, even French Canadians, although in terms of volunteers, around two-thirds were British-born immigrants and a third were English Canadians, with less than 1,000 French Canadians initially volunteering. Soon, 32,000 Canadians were ready to fight, and they started arriving in England in October, worried that the war might end, but I think as we all know, the war did not end very quickly. Now, although at first they fought under British command, the Canadians eventually fought under Canadian command. In 1917, Canada's war effort was burdened by a lack of volunteers, so conscription was introduced, which caused fierce backlash from French Canadians. In the end, most conscripts never went anywhere, with the war ending in 1918. Now, although the war was over, Canada would never be the same again. The success of the Canadians during the war developed a new sense of national identity, although this came at the cost of 67,000 deaths and 173,000 wounded. Even before the end of the war, major changes were seen, with prohibition on alcohol introduced on April Fool's 1918, although sadly it was not a joke, and women were given the right to vote the next month, although this did not apply to Quebec. In August, the first general strike in Canadian history started after labor activist Albert Goodwin was shot by the police. In September, the Royal Canadian Air Force was created. Now, with negotiations for peace taking place in Paris, Robert Borden demanded that Canada have a separate seat at the negotiations, which was opposed by both the United Kingdom and the United States. However, Borden pointed out Canada's enormous losses as proof of its commitment to the war effort, which eventually led to it gaining a seat in the Peace Conference as well as the League of Nations. Back at home, the largest strike in Canadian history happened, the Winnipeg General Strike, organized by the One Big Union in 1919. This led to the entire Winnipeg police force being fired and the army being sent in. In 1929, the Great Depression hit Canada, and it hit it hard. Canada lost 40% of its GDP, exports shrank by half, and unemployment hit 27%. But Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King responded by saying that the free market would correct itself, and so he refused unemployment relief or federal aid. This led him to lose the election in 1930 to Richard Bedford Bennett, who promised high spending but soon enacted the opposite. So he tried unsuccessfully to implement policies similar to the New Deal in the United States. Now, on an international level in 1930, Canada took Norway's colonies in the Sverdrup Islands in the far northern Arctic, and on the 11th of December 1931, the most important moment in Canadian history happened when the Statute of Westminster was passed, which ended the United Kingdom's ability to pass or nullify laws in Canada and effectively made Canada independent. Now, the newly independent country had a population of 10 million, but they were not doing well, and Bennett was blamed, causing him to lose the election to King in 1935. This time he introduced relief programs and established the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and Air Canada. Though the worst of the Depression was over by 1936, it was still ongoing. Of course, the Great Depression had global effects and led to the rise of nationalism and militarism around the world. Now, Canada cared little about what happened outside its borders and did nothing to oppose the rise of fascism in Italy, Japan, and Germany, because after all, those three countries wouldn't become a threat or anything. But Germany's rise did lead to a small amount of rearmament in Canada in 1936, and the following year, King assured the United Kingdom that it would help it in a war against Germany. However, he remained quiet after Germany's annexations of Austria and Bohemia in 1938 and 1939, respectively. Now, unsurprisingly, the rise of Germany led to a wave of Jewish emigration, but Canada raised the bar for the amount of money necessary for immigrants to have $5,000 to $15,000, and these immigrants also had to prove that they were farmers. These policies were enacted to restrict Jewish immigration, which was largely successful as only 4,000 successfully got in. Obviously, though, it's clear where this story is going, because in September, World War II began, and Canada entered its first war as an independent country. The economic effects of the event ended the Great Depression. Out of 11 million people, 1.1 million Canadians served in the military. Much effort was put into building up the Royal Canadian Air Force, and although initially facing setbacks at Hong Kong and Dieppe, Canada was involved in the successful invasions of Italy in 1943 and France the following year. However, just like in the last war, Canada faced a conscription crisis as the number of volunteers decreased, with English Canadians largely supporting conscription and French Canadians opposing it. Once again, though, it changed little as the war ended in 1945, and Canada's worst days were clearly behind it. After the war's end in 1945, Canada had changed from a rural dominion of a dying empire into a high-tech market economy with many resources. Canada's military had over 1 million members and boasted the 5th largest fleet and 4th largest air force in the world. Now that it was prosperous, Canada developed universal health care and pensions for the elderly and veterans. This prosperity attracted many immigrants, and after the war, a 4th wave of immigration happened, still mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe, and mostly to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Nevertheless, Canada soon found itself caught up in the drama of the Cold War, and it really started in 1946 when Igor Guzenko defected, revealing the existence of a Soviet spy ring in the country. This led to Canada becoming a founding member of NATO in 1949 with help from Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent. Canada now included Newfoundland, which joined Canada that year after rejecting to remain a British colony or to gain independence. And this finally gave us Canada's borders as we see them today. In 1950, when the Korean War broke out, Canada joined the anti-communist intervention against North Korea and China, and this ended in 1954-3. This war led to the beginning of Canada's reputation as an international peacekeeper in collaboration with the newly formed United Nations. Diplomat Lester Pearson proposed the creation of a UN peacekeeping force after the Suez Crisis in 1956, which led to its creation and Pearson's Nobel Peace Prize in 1957. However, the Suez Crisis would sow the seeds of distrust among the Anglophone countries, which had previously worked together so well, as Canadians were wary of British imperialism, but also of American influence in their country, especially as the US tried to place its nuclear weapons on their land. Further tensions emerged as Prime Minister John Diefenbaker refused to sever ties with Cuba after its communist revolution, which greatly annoyed the United States. Now, the 1960s saw the most Canadian kind of revolution imaginable, known as the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. Although it saw no violence, it was quite revolutionary because it saw the secularization of the government, the establishment of a welfare state, a rise of nationalism and separatism. The state replaced the Catholic Church as the establishment in Quebec, and the province quickly modernized. However, one could argue that the entire country was experiencing a quiet revolution of sorts. In 1960, Native Canadians were finally given the right to vote without having to give up their status and rights. And in 1965, Canada changed its flag from one with a British ensign to its current flag, reflecting its change from a British outpost to a multicultural society. This was also reflected in a change in immigration policy, which had previously been meant to encourage immigration from the British Isles, Italy, and Northern Europe, but it changed to one that was open to immigrants from around the world, but especially people from Asia and the Caribbean. In 1969, Canada officially became a bilingual country, but this belied the increasing threat of Quebec separatism, which culminated in the October Crisis in 1970. The Front de Libération de Québec, a separatist paramilitary group, had kidnapped a British official and had even murdered Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte, which led Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau to enact the War Measures Act. This solved what was perhaps the greatest crisis in Canadian history, and Quebec separatism would never again reach such an intense level. Pierre Trudeau was one of the most important prime ministers in Canadian history, forming the Canada we know today. He introduced official bilingualism and made Canada the first officially multicultural country. However, these policies were not universally loved across the country and led to the beginning of Western alienation in earnest, with many Western Canadians feeling that the government was not prioritizing their concerns. So would Canada survive all these changes? Well, in 1980 we saw the answer with a referendum held to determine Quebec's independence. With 60% rejecting the idea, it failed, but wouldn't be the last scare for Canada. Determined to gain full independence, Trudeau pushed for the Canada Act, which was passed in 1982. It ended the last British powers to legislate in Canada and allowed Canada to amend its constitution. It also enacted the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a bill of rights that applied to both the federal and provincial governments. Now, of course, Quebec refused to sign the bill because they always do this kind of stuff, but this was just overridden by the Supreme Court of Canada, which had enough of their shenanigans. In 1985, Air India Flight 182 was destroyed by a bomb, killing all 329 passengers, of whom 280 were Canadians. It would turn out to have been carried out by Canadian Sikh terrorists and would result in the most expensive trial in Canadian history. Now, in an attempt to finally get Quebec to agree to the signing of the Constitution, Brian Mulroney began the Meech Lake Accords in 1987 as a compromise, but their failure led to the creation of the separatist Bloc Québécois Party in 1991. In 1989, Mulroney successfully negotiated the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement, despite widespread opposition among Canadians who feared the consequences of too much integration. This was then followed by the creation of the North America Free Trade Association in 1994. In 1990, Canada joined the Gulf War against Iraq, its last major military effort during the Cold War, which ended the following year. Now, with its conclusion, military spending was cut, air raid sirens were removed from across the country, bunkers were decommissioned, and the last American bases in Canada were removed. Nevertheless, conflict was brewing at home, this time with Native Canadians, as was seen at the Oka crisis, when some Mohawk activists clashed with the Quebec government over the construction of a golf course on their burial ground. They eventually backed down after an intense standoff. The end of the Cold War did not signal the end of global conflict, and in 1992 Canada intervened in the Somali Civil War, as well as the Bosnian War and the Croatian War of Independence. Its involvement in the Yugoslav Wars saw some of the fiercest combat since Korea. Canada also intervened in the Rwandan Civil War in 1994. Just as things were calming down abroad, Canada faced its closest call as another referendum on Quebec's independence narrowly failed in 1995, with only 50.58% voting to stay. In 1998, the population of a now united Canada reached 30 million. That same year, it joined with other NATO forces in the Kosovo War, once again fighting against Yugoslavia. The 20th century ended in Canada with the last territorial change, and this happened with the creation of Nunavut, a separate territory for the Inuit people, in 1999. As the 21st century dawned, Canada joined the war in Afghanistan following the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in New York. However, Canada refused to join and in fact strongly condemned the invasion of Iraq in 2003. This caused criticism from the leader of the newly formed Canadian Conservative Party, led by Stephen Harper, whose party also opposed the Civil Marriage Act, which legalized same-sex marriage in 2005. In 2011, Canada, now under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, went to war against the forces of Gaddafi in the Libyan Civil War, and in 2014, Canada left the war in Afghanistan. But that year, it joined the war against ISIS. Now, the next year in 2015, the son of Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, became Prime Minister. And boy, do I have opinions about him that I cannot say here. In 2018, cannabis was legalized, making it the second country in the world to do so. In 2020, the COVID pandemic hit Canada, reaching the country on the 25th of January. On 2022, we saw the Canada Convoy protest against the vaccine mandates implemented by the Trudeau government, which implemented the Emergencies Act that gave Trudeau permission to forcibly remove the protesters from Ottawa. And on that controversial note, I will end the video. So you can comment your opinions on Trudeau or anything I've said in this video down below. Now, of course, I hope you enjoyed this video in general. I hope you learned something new about Canadian history. And of course, happy Canada Day to everyone. See you next time.